Don't tell me that the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass.
Hello and welcome to Shining Moon episode 29, YA and middle grade science fiction and fantasy. I'm your host, Deborah L. Davitt. This week we'll be having a conversation with David Anaxagoras, Nicole M. Wolverton, and returning guest Alicia Hilton. Let's start with some introductions. David Anaxagoras is a writer and former teacher from Southern California. His short fiction has appeared in Lightspeed and The Dread Machine. He is the creator and co-executive producer of the Amazon series Mortimer Gibbons' Life on Normal Street, for which he received a WGA Award nomination. He currently lives in Texas, but not on purpose, where he's at work on his second middle grade novel. Visit his website at davidanaxagoras.com. Welcome to the podcast, David. We just discovered that we're practically neighbors. This is wonderful.
That's fun. Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to the conversation. Alicia Hilton is an author, editor, arbitrator, professor, and former FBI special agent. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in creepy podcasts Lovecraftiana, Neon, Vestarian, Year's Best Hardcore Horror, Volumes 4, 5, and 6, and elsewhere. Her website is https://aliciahilton.com. Follow her on Twitter at AliciaHilton01 and on Facebook at AliciaHilton.161. Welcome back to the podcast, Alicia. It's lovely to have you back on.
Thanks very much for having me here. It's great to be here.
All right. And finally, we have Nicole M. Wolverton, who is the author of the upcoming young adult horror novel on the Lake Monsters, which will come out in July of 2024, and the adult psychological thriller The Trajectory of Dreams, which came out in 2013. She served as editor of Bodies Full of Burning, 2021, which is an anthology of short horror fiction through the lens of menopause, and is a Pushcart Prize-nominated writer of short stories and creative nonfiction. Nicole's work has been published in over 40 anthologies, magazines, and podcasts. Welcome, Nicole. I am pleased to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. And happy to be here with Alicia and David.
Yeah. All right, we're going to jump into the questions, and then we're going to we're going to reverse our usual order. We're going to have a reading early, but then we'll have a reading late too. So just be braced for that, listeners. There will be lots of reading on this podcast. All right, so my first question is, quite a lot of YA and middle grade fiction actually has multiple audiences. There are adults who still read YA novels because they grew up with the ongoing series and want to see how the characters grow up with them. There are parents who read alongside their children so they can discuss the stories at hand and what they mean, which covers me because I have sat down and read a lot of series with my son because he's asked me to, and I'm like, okay, I guess I will read this Dragonflight series, and it's interesting, and okay, I have questions, and he wants to talk about them at length and very in depth because he's so into them. There are educators and librarians who also read along so they can make recommendations. Who do you find to be your audience? How do you define that, and how do you write to them? And we're going to start with Nicole because she's at the top of my screen. And what's your audience, and how do you, or the multiple valences of audiences, how do you write to them?
So I don't necessarily think about adults when I'm writing for young adult, but I don't not think about adults. I believe that when you're writing for a young adult audience, you're essentially writing for someone who wants desperately to be considered an adult. And I think about that from my own experience as a teenager. I wanted someone to take me seriously. I wanted someone to give me some agency that I didn't have. I just wanted to operate in an adult sphere. And I think that when you're writing for young adults, you have to treat them like they want to be treated.
Okay. All right. I like that. Alicia, how do you, what is your audience and how do you write towards them?
I think that my audience is anyone who enjoys stories, and I also write poetry about otherness, transformation, finding yourself. Most of the people who read my work are probably adults. Most of the people who've contacted me about my work have been adults, but I know that teens and younger people, kids, also read my work. So it really is more of like who feels like this theme resonates with them. And a lot of people, I mean, I'm way past teenagerdom. A lot of people like to read stories about finding yourself and coming of age. So it's really, to me, beyond categories. It's what you enjoy, what the themes resonate with you.
All right. And David, how do you find your audience?
I think that my audience is, first of all, my audience is me. Very sort of selfish writer that way. And me when I was 12. There's something magical about that age as far as influences. And I've been writing for my 12-year-old self probably since I was 12. But also, like Alicia, anyone who it would enjoy the story or find it meaningful or resonant. I'm not going to necessarily, I don't want to exclude anyone from the story. And I feel like audiences are sort of, that's like marketing to me almost. I just want to write a darn good story, something really satisfying and meaningful. And this story might end up being more resonant with a certain age group or not. I don't know. That, to me, that's almost out of my hands. Sometimes when I'm writing something, I can kind of, shape it or start to lean towards a younger audience. But basically, if I finish the story and there aren't too many swear words, then maybe that's kid lit,
All right. One of the things I find that I prize when I'm reading something that is written from the perspective of a 12 to 13-year-old comes up in the piece that we'll be reading together by Premi Muhammad later today, is an authentically young voice. How do you stop yourself from having 40-year-old thoughts expressed in a teen perspective, or does that matter to you? Nicole?
It does matter, but I find that with young adult, it doesn't matter. Obviously, for the most part, a teenager's not going to be worrying about how to pay the mortgage or, something like that. However, in certain situations, that might not be true. If you're a kid from a poor family like I was, I was not aware at that point when I was 16 that I was from a really poor family. Like, I just didn't recognize it. But if it were a different situation, if my mom hadn't been working 2 or 3 jobs to keep the family going, and it was more on my responsibility, I think maybe I would be worrying about how the mortgage gets paid or the rent, what have you. So obviously there are things that a typical, let's say, teenager would be thinking about, but you just don't know. Your character dictates sort of their maturity level, what their concerns are, and that can really be a range.
All right. Alicia, same question. Do you find that intrusive thought? Do you find intrusive thoughts come through from your 40-year-old or your older perspective, or does it matter?
I'm actually 58.
Oh my goodness!
But I don't have any trouble. Thank you. I don't have any trouble putting myself in a younger mindset. I think that what I do is I just put myself in the mindset of my younger self. And I was a very awkward child. I was super skinny. I had crooked teeth. I was very much the ugly duckling. I was a real big nerd and didn't fit in. And so I put myself in that mindset, and I sort of stay in it when I write for, a character that's a younger age person, and think about how I was an outsider and, how I was bullied, and a lot of my characters are outsiders or people who were experiencing otherness and they don't fit in and they're trying to find their place in the world. And so I don't have any trouble, I think, putting myself in the younger mindset my voice doesn't, I don't think it vacillates. It's something that I'm good at. It's just really getting absorbed. It's kind of like method acting, because I'm an actress too.
Yes.
It's just taking on the role and embodying the role the whole time when I'm writing. And I'm writing as if I am that character, whether it's a dinosaur or a human or an extraterrestrial or you know, someone from fantasy. It's I am that character when I am being that character.
Sounds fair. David, same question. How do you stop yourself from having those thoughts expressed, those older thoughts expressed when coming out, or just the way of thinking that is older in your work? When
I have also blown way past 40, and in a way, maybe that helps. Maybe I'm just kind of young again, not too worried about some things I worried about when I was in my 20s or 30s, when I might have been closer to the age I write for sometimes. But and I do think it matters just on a level also of just authenticity and respect for the reader. I laugh sometimes when I'm reading something from a kid's point of view and the author is like shoehorning in references that are obviously from when they were a kid and not references to the culture and world of the kid's age, you know. Somehow I love Stephen King, but he still managed to reference like 2001: A Space Odyssey for a contemporary 12-year-old is probably, that's not their go-to reference material. So but it made me laugh because I could see like the boomer peeking through the curtains there. But I think, like Nicole said, it really comes down to character for me. And it's not like I'm trying to be in a kid mindset. It's like I'm trying to be in this character's mindset. And I write very close third person, usually sometimes first person. And I'm just like seeing through their eyes. And if I really know and understand the character, like I should any character, whether young or old, if I know what they desperately want, what they really need, what they fear, if I understand their relationships, then I think that's just part of writing. And that's like I would write any other character is writing a kid.
All right.
But that's what it comes down to for me.
Okay. Do any of you find that there is influence in your work from graphic novels and manga, which are also popular in YA and middle grade world? I mean, they're phenomenally, just overwhelmingly popular at this point in time. And when I had a friend who is younger than I am by an unspecified amount read a couple of your stories, she immediately pinged on, "Is this like shonen manga?" I'm like, I don't know because I don't read that. So, Nicole, do you have any influence from that?
So I will fully admit that I do not know anything at all about manga. I mean, I know what it is, and that's about it. I have read graphic novels, not necessarily graphic novels that are aimed at the young adult audience. Some I have, like the Lock and Key series, of course. But then there are others like Nailbiter, totally not meant for young adults, although a young adult would probably enjoy them if they're very into horror. However, what I will say is there's a cinematic aspect to sort of that visual medium.
Yeah.
And I'm told that most of my writing is very visual in nature. Like you can kind of see it pretty easily. And so perhaps that's how I've been influenced.
That's certainly possible. Alicia, do you have any influence out of manga or graphic novels at all?
I've read a few graphic novels, but I don't think they influence my work, and I don't read manga, so that definitely wouldn't influence me. I like absorbing my reader with essentially all the senses. I'm a very visual person, but I also like to incorporate all the senses, and I have been told my writing is kind of cinematic. And so maybe that's why it comes across as like graphic novels and manga, because I'm incorporating the visual and other senses.
All right. And David, yours in particular, your stream of consciousness story came across as like shonen manga to this person that I asked to read it, and I was wondering if there was any influence from that in your work.
I had to look up what shonen manga was because I hadn't heard the
So do
term. I'm familiar with manga, and I was a very heavy comic book reader in my younger days. I sort of fell out of the habit mostly because of the expense, and was, I think there wasn't anything directly that any manga directly that has influenced any of my writing, but I think some of that has just sort of maybe seeped into my DNA the way some influences do. I think, I was huge into Akira, and, a lot of I was an 80s kid, so, that was a time when, like, Frank Miller's Dark Knight was happening, and so it was a very exciting time in comic books. But as far as directly influencing that piece, no. And as far as, like, me referencing it or taking direct information or influence from it.
I wasn't saying directly, no, but
not especially, no.
Okay, fair enough. This was just a question that came up, and I was like, that's a good question, and that people who listen to this might actually be interested in. So this is a question more about the market as a whole, because I have a young teenager at home, and when I look for YA stories for him to read, particularly in terms of novels, because he eats them omnivorously and devours them. The YA and middle grade fantasy market is absolutely huge, and adult sci-fi is huge, but there is almost no YA or middle grade science fiction up there in the form of novels. Why do you think this is? Why is this part of the market being basically neglected by publishers, or do we know? Nicole?
So when you said that, when you sent around the questions, I was curious because I hadn't really recognized that. So I looked specifically at the 2024 debut authors this year to see sort of what they were putting out. And you're right, there is not a single like pure sci-fi novel amongst them. It's mostly YA contemporary, YA fantasy with like a little bit of romantasy thrown in. Next level down would be like YA thriller and horrors, right? So it was interesting to me to think about that in terms of, why sci-fi is being ignored or, whatever. But it might come down to the fact that the category has broadened.
Okay.
Like Hunger Games is considered sci-fi, which I would not necessarily think of it that way. Okay. But if you look up like a list of YA sci-fi, it's right at the top of the list.
Okay. And I would never have thought of that personally.
Right?
I mean, it's dystopian, but that doesn't necessarily mean sci-fi.
And now, like, it kind of looks like most of what's considered like YA sci-fi is really dystopian. Like one of the 2024 authors who had like a really big book this year, just came out about a month ago, is Mark Gregson. He published Sky's End.
Okay.
And that is very dystopian, but it's also considered a little bit sci-fi.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I don't quite know what happened to the market, but the shift might explain at least some of it.
That makes good sense to me. Alicia, do you have anything to add to that? I know we were talking before the show about how you've had a lot of success with short fiction that is sci-fi, that is YA. So let's speak to that.
Well, I think that a lot of the work that appeals to me is cross-genre because that's what I like to write. So when I was thinking about that question, why isn't there more YA science fiction? One of the things that popped into my mind is zombies. Some people categorize zombie stories as science fiction. Sometimes they are categorized as horror. Sometimes they're categorized as fantasy. But one of the series that I really enjoyed was Jonathan Mayberry's Rotten Ruin series. And those are zombie stories. So whether you want to say it's science fiction, horror, or fantasy, or a mashup of all, that definitely is, I would categorize as YA. And we have very strong science fiction elements. Another author who's written some great young adult or middle-grade zombie fiction is M.R. Carey, The Girl with All the Gifts, The Boy on the Bridge. Beautiful work, really fine. And I think that those, I read, the books as an adult, but they could also appeal to teens and younger people, to kids. And, there's strong science fiction elements, but you also have, fantasy, you also have horror, dystopian. But when you think about science fiction, this pure science fiction, I think you're right. There aren't a lot of pure novels out there that are YA science fiction, and I don't know why that is. But the thing is that if you're trying to write to the market, like if you're an author and you're writing a novel and you're thinking, oh, this sells, so I should write this. I actually don't think that's a good strategy. I think that you need to write the story.
Your book.
It needs to be told, your own book. And if it's a great book, you will find an agent, you will find an audience, whether you're going with Big Five or independent publishing or self-publishing. If you write something phenomenal, you will find readers. You will find people who will discover your work and love it, and maybe you end up writing a series or other books that are of the same type. So I don't think it's smart to write to the market, because trends also change. For all we know, 5 years from now, there's going to be an extremely strong market for YA pure science fiction. So I think that as a writer, who I give advice to other writers, and I've critiqued manuscripts and taught workshops, you really need to write your own book. And that's also, it's like everyone has their own background. You have your own special things that, you experience growing up, your own skill set, your own knowledge from whether it's work or experiences. And that can make your work unique and give it, a genuine, voice, and be really compelling. And rather than thinking, oh, this sells, so I should do it. You're not going to have passion when you write like that. You need to be passionate about your work too.
Yeah. All right, David, have you written YA sci-fi, or do you find that you are more willing to gravitate towards sci-fi, to middle grade and YA fantasy?
I actually went out with I thought it was science fiction. It might have been more horror. I think what happened, especially with middle grade, was there was just a glut of dystopian novels. Everyone was working on a dystopian novel.
Yeah.
I think that's as close. Whether or not it's science fiction, I think that's what publishers think of when they think of science fiction right now. And there was even there was even like a hint or a whiff of dystopia about something, it was a very hard sell. And which I found out when I went out with my not dystopian novel last year. But it got some comparisons to Maze Runner for some reason. And, there's just no accounting for what publishers are, I think a lot of decisions are just fear-based mostly. And they were running away from dystopia at the moment. But I've seen some, it's out there if you look for it. I read Kenneth Oppel's Overthrow series recently. I think the first book is Bloom, about an alien plant invasion, which was very...
I'll have to take a look at this.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's a great ride. And it was very sci-fi. I know Greg Van Eekhout has written some science fiction. Weird Kid, I think, I don't know if he's done anything recently, but he did Weird Kid. There was The Last Quinista, which was, I think, an award winner, came out rather recently. For even younger kids, there's The Wild Robot, which is sort of almost a picture book about a robot on an island surviving with the local wildlife. And I run across it and I see it, but it does seem that fantasy is getting a lot of the attention. Also, I think
Got a lot of traction.
I think contemporary books are also very big. Realistic contemporary books are just having a moment especially in middle grade right now. And maybe it's not so much that there isn't sci-fi, it's just that other things are sort of, taking up space in the market or blooming right now.
That's certainly fair. I'm just speaking as a consumer, because when I do a search for sci-fi YA, and Amazon goes, nope. I go, well, I guess we're getting another series about dragons for my son. So not that that's a bad thing, but I'd love him to branch out a little bit. Right, we are going to move to a reading from Alicia Hilton, because Alicia has to leave us early today, as I mentioned earlier. What are you reading from? When was it published? And dive right in.
Okay, I'm going to read from Evolution, my story that was first published in an anthology from Storgy, Annihilation Radiation, and it's going to be reprinted very soon in AI Robot, which is an anthology from JayHenge, and this story was published in 2020. So
We'll be discussing this one later. So
great. The cockroach skittered up my leg, crawled into my lap, and began his grooming ritual. Ito's mouth moved from side to side as the left feeler slipped in and out, digestive enzymes in his saliva washing away radiation. My best friend always started with the left feeler, then right, followed by left foreleg and right, then the middle and hind legs. Through my worn-out t-shirt, the barbs on his legs tickled. Other clients reclined on the massage table alone, but Aito preferred to rest on my body. Since he weighed 3 pounds, he felt heavy, but I didn't mind. When he'd finished cleaning himself, I used my fingertips to stroke from his head to the thorax and abdomen. He rubbed his feelers against my neck. Cuddling with Aito reminded me of Grandma's teacup poodle. They were the same size and adored being petted, except Reiji's fur was plush and Aito's exoskeleton was smooth and cool, moist from the damp air in the tunnel below what used to be Nara. In the old world, humans weren't friends with insects, and the undead only existed in stories. There was no in-between, no true purgatory until survivors of the war rose from the rubble. Mother said she used to be a bookkeeper for a real estate brokerage firm in Kyoto. After the bomb, she discovered her true calling and became a teacher. Our hosts were eager to improve their mathematical skills. Cockroaches loved arithmetic. My memories were fragmented, but the acrid taste of longing stood out more than anything. Above all else, I yearned to spend a day at the beach, to feel the sun's rays caressing my face, to run barefoot on the sand, hot and gritty, then plunge into the surf. What would it feel like to be enveloped by a wave? What did seawater taste like?
very nice. That's a
Thank
lovely excerpt. It makes me, if I hadn't already read it, it would make me want to read more.
Thank you.
All right. We are going to move into the discussions of each of your works. And since we started with evolution, we're going to start with discussing evolution overall. Sakura is a 10-year-old living in a fallout shelter in Japan. Her job is to perform massage and physical therapy for the non-human members of the community, which includes that 3-pound cockroach we were just introduced to. Human-sized mutated honeybee named Jolene, who is also her classmate, and eventually a terrier assigned to digging the tunnels and expanding the living environment of the fallout shelter. Sakura stands up for the non-humans' rights in class, saying it isn't fair that they get all the menial jobs, and says that she's angry that the world was destroyed by humans. This results in her being rushed to a reboot center where her mother fixes her mistakes with her by drilling into her head and provides her with a twin sister who does everything right. Sakura still has problems with that. But she now knows that she's not real, but she doesn't want to risk her existence any further than she has. This would not be an Alicia story without the horror elements. You blend genres so fluidly, but there's always that little hint of the surreal that makes it an Alicia Hilton story. Initially, the large mutated insects are the vector for horror, but then the disconnect, where you discover that she's not a real girl after all, becomes the real horror, or at least the fact that her mom disregards her as something that she can fix is another nexus of horror. So she has to pretend to be docile and accepting lest she be altered by her mother again. How do you go about writing horror elements for a younger audience than you do for an adult audience? How do you handle that?
Well, one of the things I consider is the level of violence, and then I also consider whether there should be any, sexuality in a story. But to me, when I'm writing, I don't necessarily know what my target audience is. The age of the protagonist is one factor, and there I would say, I guess you categorize that as middle grade, although I think a lot of adults read that story. The rest of the anthology was really targeted more towards adults. But I try to embody the character, with a genuine voice and, the concerns that the character has and the themes that come up in the novel or other factors that determine, whether this really is something I'm writing for adults or for kids or for both. I don't think I ever write something that's just for kids.
Okay.
I do think that even if you have a young protagonist, the story, if it has universal themes, if it has issues that, lots of, people would find appealing, then it can appeal to someone of pretty much any age, even someone who's not even old enough to read, if someone reads the story out loud to them.
Something I did a lot of with my old books to my son when he was younger. When I would read stuff that was well above his age category to him for his bedtime story, simply because I was really bored with reading stuff that was on level with him. So, all right, where did you get the inspiration for this specific story? Where did this come from?
Well, for that story, a lot of times I write something just because I have something in my head and I want to write it. With that story, I did hear about the submission call. And so I was specifically wanting to write something that was dystopian, that had radiation as, part of the plot. When I was writing it at first, I was thinking, okay, this is a real human. Then I was thinking, is she a zombie? So I went through different versions of the story. The first version I wrote, she was a person that hadn't risen from the dead. The second version of the story, she was a zombie. The third version of the story, which is the one that was the final version that was published, she was an android. And to me, which version resonated with me the most, which felt the most honest. And to me, the android was something that felt it really resonated with me, because one of the things that bothers me a lot, and that is a theme that comes up in my fiction, is otherness and finding your place in the world and belonging. And this is especially a timely issue right now when we think about artificial intelligence and robotics and androids, because technology is going to become more and more part of our lives. And when you have a sentient being, whether it's a human or an animal or something, a robot, an android, who controls that being? Does the being have its own, identity and control, or is the being, a slave or a subject, or, what is that person, that thing, in our world? And so that's something that bothers me. Humans, a lot of people just sort of believe, we're the top of the pyramid, we should just control everything. And I don't think that's necessarily right. I think I'm also passionate about animal rights, and it bothers me when animals get abused. And so those things creep into my stories a lot. And I do edit myself a lot. I'm also an editor. I've edited anthologies. So it's common for me to come up with different versions of my work. And I also sometimes write poems that turn into stories, or vice versa. I have to find the the right form, and I play with something, and I changed a lot when I'm writing.
Yeah, I do the same thing. All right, we're going to skip over to David, and the first story that we're going to talk about is "The Boy Who Ran from His Fairy Heart," which appeared in Lightspeed, August 2023, issue 159. This is a love at first sight story between a human boy of 13 and an ageless fairy boy, though it starts in media res with a terrible accident and being saved from certain death by the fairy boy, Finley. The human family doesn't approve of the initial relationship as we move back in time to see its development, and they send their son away to live with his uncle, where an elk nearly leaps through the windshield of their truck, causing the accident that the story starts with. The family blames the elk's presence on the fairy, and the boy runs into the woods to be with Finley, binding their hearts together permanently. The story is marked by the elevated feelings of adolescence and of life-changing decisions made seemingly on impulse, as adolescents tend to do. What do you want young readers to take away from this story?
I think anybody who reads the story, and especially younger people, who might feel like a stranger in their own family or like an outsider at times, they should know that they're not alone in that feeling, and that they belong in the world and there's a place for them, that you deserve love and love is awaiting for you, even if you aren't feeling it right now. Hold on, reach out. I think that's the thing about stories for younger people, is that I think that really divides stories from adult and younger, is that there should be a light at the end of the tunnel for younger kids. I think it's cruel to be cynical or nihilistic in marketing something hopeless to kids. So for me, a kid's story really minimally has to have some hopeful message in the end. It can be dark, it can be brutal, but it shouldn't ultimately be nihilistic. And I would like to think someone comes away from this story and my other stories feeling some amount of comfort and feeling less alone.
That's a really good point. When my son was a bit younger than he is now, there was a book that was marketed as a Rick Riordan Presents. It's not by Rick Riordan, but it is one of the affiliated authors. And I don't remember the author's name, and I don't remember the title. I just know that it came to the end of the book, and within one chapter of the end, my son stopped and was basically throwing the book across the room and sobbing and everything like that.
Oh, no.
Because the main character died and his dog died. 1-2 punch. And then I picked up the book and I was trying to calm him down, and I opened to the next page of the final chapter, and that was a lie. This is all, it was all, and I'm like, he couldn't even go on past that because the dog died, which is the gut punch that so many of us grew up with Old Yeller and Red Fern Girls. With an autistic boy, you can't, it was very sensitive. You can't do that to him. And the main character die at the same time, and then expect them to turn the page and say, well, that was actually a fib, and everything's actually okay. That doesn't work for every kid out there, and I'm sure that a lot of kids didn't buy into that. So it was one of those ones where I'm just like, and they thought this was a good idea. The light at the end of the tunnel is necessary, particularly at certain age groups.
I feel death sometimes is just, it's reaching for some cheap and easy drama.
Yeah.
I think it can be handled appropriately, but a lot of times I feel like if there's been a death, or there was a death, or it's a bad death, it's just like an easy shorthand way of ginning up.
It's a shock thing. I once had somebody back in my fanfic days who sent me a comment saying, if you don't kill off characters, nobody will ever take you seriously as an author. And I'm like, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that, because I would rather have complexity. I would rather have somebody continue to live and see what happens to them next and how they interact with people. And I would. how they get into difficulties. I would rather see that than, well, now they're dead, and
But I
now
think,
the complexity and the nuance is gone.
I mean, I think you're really right about the complexity. It's a tougher job to say have a middle grade protagonist whose parents are alive. What do you do with them? How does the story work? That's a whole nother set of relationships you have to work with. And how does a middle grade protagonist have their independent sort of hero's journey when they still have parents around?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's sort of a lazy, killing them off is sort of a very lazy thing to do.
Mm-hmm. I tend to agree with that because when I read some of these middle grade fiction things that my son brings home, because he still loves some of them and he wants to see how things have progressed from when he was younger, and he wants to continue reading this long-standing series of 17 books. Okay, fine, I'll continue to buy those. That's fine. And I read them and I go, where are the parents and why are they permitting this kid to do this? And why is there this glaring absence? And that's a whole different story. So I'm going to ask you, instead of being off on this tangent, which is a lovely tangent, but we'll talk more about your work now. What gave you the inspiration for this story?
I had a flash, a visual image of a boy riding a turtle into a sort of enchanted wood. And I don't know where that mental image came from, but I basically followed the boy into the forest, and this is the story that came out.
All right.
This also combined with a mini episode of Doctor Who, Night of the Doctor, where the Doctor, the Eighth Doctor, crashes on a planet and dies, and then his regeneration can be guided by potions that have been created for him. Choose the potion, choose what you want. What do you need to be? A warrior, a doctor? What qualities do you want? It's just one of my favorite episodes, and I've always sort of been fascinated by that idea of that moment where you are discovering yourself, or where you're like, I need this in myself. And I just thought it would be kind of interesting, to have Sheridan face that choice. And it scares him, this idea of who, I'm becoming someone. Who am I becoming? I'm growing out of my childhood. I'm taking my first step into the bigger world, and I'm sort of realizing things about myself, and this doesn't fit in with what my family has taught me a boy should be. How do I handle that? So that sort of combined into that. And also, finally, I've written a lot about boys and friendships between boys. And there was a Disney Pixar movie recently. Is it Luca? The one about the sea monsters, boys who are sea monsters. And it's a story. It's a great friendship in the movie. But there was sort of this discourse about, is this just a coded gay relationship? And is that subtext? And why didn't they just make it text? Why is it always cryptic? And I think it's really important to show boys being friends and being close. And that's not necessarily a gay relationship. Boys' friendships, that's something I've written about a lot. But I also recognize sometimes you need to go there, and I couldn't keep writing about boys who were close and they just never acknowledge that there could be a gay relationship as well. So that was time for that in my writing as well. And so all those things sort of combined together.
All right. I'm looking at the time, and I know that we're going to lose Alicia here in about 10 minutes, so we're going to skip Nicole. I'm sorry. We will come back to you. I will not forget you. But we're going to talk about Alicia's final story, which is Perfumer in Purgatory, which appeared in Dreamforge. I will have a link to the story in the comments. The protagonist has been sent to Purgatory after being murdered by her stepfather because she gave her best friend Sandy, who'd been molested, a Molotov cocktail with which to take vengeance on her molester. And the molester shot Sandy twice with a shotgun. So according to the arcane rules of the afterlife, She is the murderer in spite of the fact that somebody else pulled the trigger. She's been the perfume seller in purgatory for decades and has seen the worst of humanity several times over as a result, until the day a murder-suicide couple, a mother and her abused daughter, visit her stand, and the mother tries to barter for her perfumes using her daughter's hair, and then threatens to throw her daughter into the fiery river nearby to escape punishment for destroying the perfume stand in a fit of rage. I wonder if the mother's name was Karen. The protagonist throws herself and the murdering mother into the river of fire instead, though she's knocked away just in time by one of the guardians of purgatory before she can burn to death, and discovers that through self-sacrifice the doors to paradise open. Again, this is an Alicia Hilton tale. We see multiple different genres moving smoothly in and out. We see there are elements of the horrific. We see there are elements of the religious. There are elements of the surreal. There are elements of YA. What sets the story apart from your adult work? What makes this one specifically YA in your opinion?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned hope earlier. You're talking about hope. I think that was David.
Yeah.
All of my fiction that has protagonists that are young, whether they're children or teens, there's always hopeful aspects to it. And although this girl, who started off as a young teen in the beginning of the story, has been in purgatory for decades, so essentially she's now an adult, she still has a young teen mindset because that's the age that she was when she died. And yes, this is horror. It also has, taser prods, so there's some science fiction in it, and there's fantasy, there's crime fiction, there's mystery, but it is hopeful horror. And a lot of my horror, even the horror that I don't have, where I don't have kid protagonists, has hopeful aspects, because I try to be optimistic. And I think in our world, which can be kind of a cruel place, it's important to have something, some grain of positivity. And so this, I think, I would consider to be fiction for younger readers and adults, partially because of the age of the protagonist, partially because of the hopeful aspect, and partially because the violence is very toned down. When I've written things that are where it's an adult protagonist and it's much more brutal, then I get much more visceral with my descriptions. And, one of the things I toyed with is, should I describe some of the brutality in more depth? Should I, it's like incineration or beatings by the demons, things like that. And I decided not to do that. And it was a conscious decision because I wanted this story to be something that younger readers would want to read. And also because the market that I was specifically targeting it for, which is Dreamforge, it's a great magazine. They love hopeful stories. And
yes, they do.
So it was a conscious decision to, even though the setting, it's purgatory, but in my version of purgatory, you have a lot of demons running around and there's punishments. I didn't go further and make it like hardcore horror. I have written hardcore horror, and my work has been in Year's Best Hardcore Horror 3 times. But I like to write stories, that have some optimism, some positivity, and even in a bleak world, there's a glimmer of hope. There's a hope that there will be positive change. And so this is one of those stories.
All right. Thank you so much for having been on the podcast. I will let you go early enough so that you can get to your next appointment. It was a pleasure having you on again.
Thank you. And if anyone wants to read more of my work, I will mention an anthology that just came out, Back to Omnipark. I co-edited the anthology, and I also have a story in it. It was published in December. All of the stories are brand new stories, never before seen stories. My story, Chimera, has a 18-year-old lesbian protagonist. It's a story that is horror, but it's also fantasy, science fiction, crime fiction. It's about otherness, transformation, monsters, injustice, and love that endures beyond the grave. And the other stories in the anthology aren't specifically YA or middle grade, but one of them I'll mention, Gwendolyn Kai's story, which is how to survive a birthday party at the Dragonfly Dining Terrace. The protagonist is someone who is an adult, but she has a young voice, and that story has a lot of themes about coming of age and finding yourself. And to me, someone who's in their 40s or 50s or even older can still be finding themselves and could be trying to figure out, who they are and what their place is in the world. And so age is just one factor in thinking about, what kind of book would appeal to a person. So I highly recommend that readers pick up Back to Omnipark, and each story is illustrated, and there's lots of other art in the book. So thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It was great being here, and I really enjoyed our conversations.
Thank you so much. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, now we're going to bop to Nicole Wolverton. And her first story is From Shore to Sea, which was originally published in the autumn 2023 issue of The Colored Lens. Summer girl Jeannie spends her last night with local girl Emma, trying to find a way to force the universe to keep them together in Homer, Alaska. They use spellcraft and the force of their intentions to try to force the universe to a shape more pleasing to them. But while Jeannie goes home to the RV that she shares with her aunt to prepare to leave the next morning, Emma dies on the beach of cold and exposure. Jeannie sees a glimpse of her and believes that her girlfriend has found the ghosts that dwell on the shore and will be there eternally, and vows that she'll never stop coming back here and searching for the ghosts to be with them and her. Much like in David's story, there's the heightened emotion of adolescence and life-changing decisions based on a few weeks of infatuation. What do you want younger readers to take away from this story?
That their feelings are valid.
Okay.
So often, adults thinking about teenage or teenage readers, they think that YA writing is less than, or they think that the feelings that they're experiencing are not real. So in this story, I think you said it, there's like a few weeks of, quote unquote infatuation.
Yeah, it's hard as an adult to gauge how intense the emotions of adolescence actually are.
Yes. And obviously when you are in love, when you're like 16 or 17, you are in love. And so even though it was just a few weeks for them, it's the real thing.
So real.
And so a lot of this is just, yes, your feelings are valid, even if you have like 3 weeks worth of joy and wonderfulness. But it's also a story that is a little bit, be careful of what you wish for.
Yes.
Be careful, because there's tragedy ahead if you let your emotions get to be too much.
Yeah, I found that the subtext of the story was almost bordering on a suicide pact.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's why my next question is, do you consider this to be YA horror? And if so, where does the horror lie in it for you? Because it is the text approves of the relationship, and it is a bittersweet ending because we are validating the emotions. But I felt, wow, that is a really big step to have a suicide pact based on a few weeks. That is really scary stuff, particularly as a parent. That is terrifying stuff.
But you have to keep in mind, it's an intense feeling, and that those feelings can really be overwhelming.
Yes, it can.
So the horror for me, I think, well, it depends on how you look at it, right?
Yeah,
if you're
it
thinking
is.
about it just from a purely what is horror standpoint, yes, it absolutely fits within the horror genre, because, I think what people don't seem to remember a lot of times is that horror is a huge genre.
It is. It really is.
Yeah. I mean, you can have everything from like almost a cozy ghost story where nobody dies on page to, splatterpunk where everyone in the world is dying in very horrifying ways.
Yeah.
And I tend not to write splatterpunk, so maybe naturally my writing is sort of pulled back a little bit to make it appropriate. But I always like to tell people this. So when I was writing my master's thesis, I have a master's in horror and storytelling. The thing that I found out is that many people consider the first horror story is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Which it's this ancient Mesopotamian thing where there is only one little section where the protagonist holds up the head of his friend and the head has maggots dripping off of it. And that is considered horror. I mean, nothing really happens. It's just this guy has a head that's dripping maggots. So, horror is meant to shock. It's meant to do a whole lot of other things to your emotions, but it's also just meant to give you the sense of creeping dread.
Yes.
And at its most basic form, that's what it does. And I think in From Shore to Sea, you sort of get that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The ending definitely gave me that sense of creeping dread. It was very well established, particularly as they're driving away, because I know that her emotions are going to trigger her to, if she's not stopped, if she doesn't, find other outlets in life, she's going to wind up right back here on this beach, whether it's when she's 18 or she's 80. And she will be dragged back down into where the ghosts live. And that is definitely just, it's horrific. And my hat's off to you for that.
As far as YA goes, I'm also someone who thinks that YA is a broad category. And authorial 10 aside, it doesn't really matter if it has a YA protagonist. I am there for it to be a YA book.
Okay.
Carrie by Stephen King, Christine. I read those books when I was probably like 12. And to me, those are YA books because I really just identified with Carrie because I was an outsider. I identified with, what's his name, Artie and Christine. Again, because I just didn't feel like I fit in anywhere.
Yeah.
And even more recently,
I think it's the story of a lot of authors' lives.
Oh, 100%. Even more recently, Stephen Graham Jones' book, My Heart is a Chainsaw. His protagonist, Jade, is 18. She's just graduated from high school. And yes, she's absolutely focused on trying to prevent a serial killer in her community. But she's also dealing with the stuff that normal young adults deal with at that point in their lives. So to me, that's a YA book, even though it was 100% not marketed that way. And David, I think of you saying that kind of choice is a marketing thing.
Yeah.
So everything is broad strokes for me. So even though maybe to some people this might not speak to them as YA, it is for me.
One of the things that people who don't write, who might stumble onto this podcast for whatever crazy reason, is when you're writing your pitch about your book, is they generally ask you for comps. And if you have written something that is completely outside of what is currently being marketed and written, such as the sci-fi YA that I was talking about earlier, trying to figure out on what shelf you would shelve your book next to is a really difficult thing to do. So they're asking you to market yourself even before they do some of their work for them, before you even get it in front of their nose. Please read my stuff. Please read my stuff. No, does it actually fit on our existing shelves somewhere? Please read my stuff. Yeah. We're going to switch back to David with his story, We Shall Not Be Bitter at the End of the World, which again appeared in Lightspeed, this time just here in January. So it's a very recent story. Issue 164. I'll have a link in the comments. As the reality-bending cosmic menace Wormwood hurtles towards Earth, a 12-year-old boy celebrates his final birthday, a little in advance because he won't have the opportunity otherwise. Finding hope among an unlikely collection of unusual friends and fantastical creatures. Aliens and Bigfoot and killer bee swarms as a collective intelligence all make time with the remnants of a family that used to run a circus. This is a strongly stream of consciousness story, a writing style that is challenging to read, but ultimately rewarding. We talked about how audience is sort of a marketing tool. This appeared in Lightspeed, which isn't a YA or middle grade magazine, not like, say, Cast of Wonders or Cicada. The average reader at Lightspeed is going to be probably college educated, So I guess my question that I was originally going to ask you doesn't really pertain because you weren't writing your story towards them. You just wrote a story that you wanted to write. So how did you come up with this one? And we have hope at the end, which again makes it fall into your category of how YA has hope at the end and so on and so forth. So again, what was your
Right.
inspiration and how did you come to write this?
I was experimenting with writing to a prompt every morning, just a
Ooh.
10 minutes in a journal. Basically, I wanted an excuse to use my fountain pens, which I don't get enough chance to use. And I did this for I lasted 60 days or so, but I had a couple short stories pop out of it. I was just trying to gather material, just trying to see what was in me. And the prompt for this story was write about something that hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
And I thought, how do you write? The story is what happened. How do you write about something that hasn't happened? So I started thinking about feelings of apprehension or anticipation. And especially at the time I wrote this, there was the joke of, can the meteor just come and get it over with? Are we, waiting for the apocalypse to just finally happen? It seemed like we're living in the end times, but they refuse to end. They just keep going and going.
Yeah.
And so I wrote down, we're all waiting for Wormwood, and kept writing. And by the end of the page, Bigfoot had come out of the woods to challenge Big Paw to a rock lifting contest. That was basically it. And it was pretty smooth. And it's one of the quickest stories I ever wrote. And the sort of voice of it helped that the voice of it came to me right away. I'm turning into a very voicey writer for some reason. I don't know. But once I get a handle on the voice of a story, it makes it so much easier to write.
Yes, it does.
And this was a 12-year-old boy who talked or wrote like a lot of 12-year-olds that I knew. I had tutored some. I worked as a rec leader at the YMCA and after school care. And when they relate a story or something, they just keep talking. There's no...
Yes. I have noticed this about my son.
So that's sort of how I approached writing it, was just this just stream of consciousness almost. And it just felt very authentic to me as a way of telling the story.
All right. I thank you very much. And we're going to skip back over to Nicole with her final story, which is The North American Guide to Animal Slaughter, which was originally published in the December 2020 anthology Slasher Torta, which I love as a pun because my favorite cake in the world is Sacca Torta. So I grew up eating it because we had a lovely cafe in Reno called Bavarian World. And so I loved how they made it. And every time I've tried to make it myself, it has come out dry and terrible. And unfortunately, when I've talked to people who have actually gone to the Hotel Sacha and in Bavaria, they go, yeah, it's dry and kind of terrible there too. So I'm like, you did it correctly at home. I'm like, oh, then I don't know what Bavarian World was doing because it was not dry and it was wonderful. So, high school student Violet inherits her elderly neighbor's house and a curse no one ever knew about. After eating a slice of cake left in the freezer, Violet is left craving human blood and flesh. Her best friend Nyla is the only one Violet trusts to help. But Nyla smells very good, like sunlight, like cake. Absolutely craveable. This is definitely horror. It belongs in something called Slasher Torta. But what makes it YA horror in particular? When we had P.A. Cornell on the first episode on horror and dark fantasy, one of her stories, When the Streetlights Go Off, was about two teenage girls. And it was horror, but it certainly didn't read as YA. And is it just the fact that there's the hope in? Or is there hope at the end of this one? Because there definitely wasn't at the end of Streetlights Go Off. Oh boy, there was no hope in that story.
So what I will say about this particular story is that it was cut down Well, all right. So I have a novel that I'm currently shopping out called Meat Sweats.
Okay.
And it's Violet's story. But there was a call from Slasher Tort, which is an anthology that's entirely made of cake fiction. And I had this novel that had this cake thing happening. And so I kind of squished down an earlier version of the novel into chapters as it's sort of laid out. And the novel is perhaps a little more hopeful than the story that came out of it.
Okay.
The story itself, the short story, I should say, to me is sort of a metaphor for the transition from kid to adult. And you end up sort of almost destroying your child self in the process. And that to me is what her best friend represents, is that childhood that is being destroyed as she's becoming an adult.
Okay, interesting.
You could also kind of look at it as a puberty metaphor if you really, really want to think about it that way.
Okay.
Yeah. Or you could think about it as like Garden of Eden plus a little bit more horror.
Okay, I can take that. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
But again, it's YA horror for sure. The protagonists are YA. It just, as David and I think Alicia has also said, does not have that bit of hope at the end.
Yeah, it definitely does not. It is full on horror.
Yeah.
And it is less subtle than your first story that we talked about. It is very much in your face, but it belongs totally in an anthology called Slasher Tort. And now I kind of want to read the rest of the stories in the book.
It's actually a really great anthology. Ellen Datlow called it out in her Best Horror of the Year series that year. Just to mention it because it's such an interesting anthology topic. Yeah. I could not say no to that.
All right, we're going to go ahead, and what we do on this segment on Sprockets, we lift somebody else up and we talk about somebody else's work. So the story that was recommended by one of you wonderful people was from the Journal of Sawyer L. Gibbs, Hero, age 13 and a half, by Premi Muhammad in Small Wonders. Again, I will link to it in the comments. Sawyer is a young boy who saw the advent of the Babbler, a catastrophic monster that attacked San Francisco. He tried to get in touch with his parents to come pick him up and get him away from the monster. His mom sent a text back that she was sending his father to pick him up, but his father never arrived. This journal shows in poignant detail and with an authentically young voice the concerns of this young man, who apparently defeated the Babbler, but that's all off screen. Only his relationship with his dad matters, a relationship strained by the fact that his father never showed up to his dance recitals in the past and didn't show up for him while the world was effectively ending. But his dad didn't have the courage to potentially watch his son die and admits to that, giving the feeling of a breakthrough and some dynamism to the ending. And what did we like about this story? What did we not like about this story? Nicole?
I love this story. I read it when it first came out, and the voice is so lovely. And the way that she tells it is really just very of the age.
Yes.
But also, for me, as someone who had an absent father, it was so relatable. And it has the type of breakthrough that I always wish that I had.
Yeah.
And so I think, particularly if you have that kind of a relationship with a parent growing up, like, this is the thing that's going to appeal to you the most.
Yeah, understood. David, what did you like or dislike about this story?
Well, I heavily agree with Nicole that this has got a wonderful voice. This is one of those stories that feels very authentic, told from the perspective of the teen protagonist.
Yeah.
And what I thought was, I mean, this is flash fiction. So much is accomplished in this story. This is an epic story squeezed down into flash fiction, and it's just masterful on a technical level.
Yes, it is.
But I thought it was delightful that the thing that is usually subtext in like a big action movie where you have like the monster attacking, and then there's this little runner of the relationship between, you know, the protagonist and their love interest, or the father-son relationship or what. that's what this story is about. And the fact that the monster fighting happens almost completely off the page,
Yes.
it was so delightfully subversive. And it
Yes.
really put what was most important right front and center in this story. It just made it such a great read, with that great voice. And also, it didn't it didn't become too sentimental in the end. It was like, oh, we sort of hugged. It was super awkward. It didn't fall into that trap of like everything turning out great in the end. But there was that little tiny little ray of hope at the end.
I will say that I had to go back and reread the story to verify that no, the feat of the babbler is entirely off page. I was like, congratulations on getting the award for defeating the monster from the mayor's office, son. You did a great job. And I had to go back and reread and go, yeah, I didn't miss it. It wasn't there.
It was a great way to lean on the trope of,
Oh, yeah.
And then, we lured the babbler into the science center, and after we defeated it, blah, 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 blah. That was like not the important part. Sawyer is like not concerned with the babbler. It's about the dad is the story.
Exactly. Yeah, the spine of the story, the author definitely knows exactly where that is, where the concern of the character is, and yeah, it's masterfully done. All right, this is where we switch gears, and we're going to have a reading from Nicole. Nicole, would you like to go ahead and read? Tell us what you're going to read, and then read it. 5 to 10 minutes, please.
So we're going to make this one a little bit shorter, I think.
Okay.
Let me get to my spot. I'm going to read the last sort of quote-unquote chapter of the North American Guide to Animal Slaughter. There's something about it that is fun to read. All right. Where am I? All right. Violet can't stop shivering, even after showering off the rest of the blood in Miss Putterbaugh's bathroom, even after exchanging her blood-stained clothes for something clean, even after her mother calls to say the police have sequestered the crowd inside the arena for questioning. But no one understands why. Violet thinks of Karen's staring eyes, of the blood. She touches her stomach. The cake could be coincidence. She did feel a flutter in her stomach when she ate it. Fetuses do that. The prom was only a month ago. Do month-old fetuses cause flutters? Google tells her no. The fetus is only the size of a poppy seed. A murderous poppy seed. Poppy seeds are in cake sometimes. Violet really wants more cake. She starts with the cookbooks in the living room. She wants the smell of light back, chasing itself through her veins. She searches the house and comes up with nothing. There's only one place left she can think of to look. The backyard shed. Violet edges through the shed door and flicks the light switch. The inside of the shed is sparkling clean, with a wooden table against the back wall that stretches from one side of the shed to the other. Several saws hang from pegboards mounted next to the table, and on the edge lies a thick book with a yellow cover. The title, The North American Guide to Animal Slaughter. She takes the book with her back inside the house to wait for Nyla. She perches on the couch and flips through the book. Each chapter illustrates the proper way to slaughter a different animal and cut it into parts. Cows, sheep. The photos are bloody, as bad as the women's room. Toward the back, Miss Putterbaugh's spiky handwriting marks the chapter on pigs. Luke and her father talk pigs constantly, but the only thing Violet knows is that pig anatomy is similar to human anatomy. Miss Putterbaugh's handwriting labels exactly what's different in humans. Karen's eyes seem to stare up from the page. Paper clipped to the next page is a single piece of paper with a list of names and dates. Violet digs out her phone and searches the first name on the list. Charles Vesey III, missing for 30 years. Next is Bernard Abernathy. His blood-covered car was found 25 years ago, but not him. It goes on, name after name, missing, presumed dead, sometimes suspicion of foul play. Karen's voice whispers in Violet's head, "Think. Make the connection, you freak." Violet refuses. It's the poppy seed. It's the hormones. She turns the page, Written in the margin is the recipe for Miss Potterbaugh's almond cake. There, third line down. 1 cup of mincemeat made from suet. Human suet. She heaves the book away from her and tries to make herself small, so small that she cannot remember the name of the woman she murdered, the woman she ate. So small that she cannot remember the taste of the cake. So small that she cannot hear the front door when it opens. But suddenly Nyla is there, and her lips are moving, saying words that Violet cannot hear. And when Nyla smells so amazing, like sunshine on grass. Violet surges off the couch. She takes a half step forward, then another, circling around Nyla. Another half step forward, circle around. It's a dance. And Nyla doesn't know the steps. But Violet does.
Ooh, love the ending. It's so visceral. All right. Going forward, do you have something coming out soon or out recently that you'd like other people to read? Nicole, do you have anything out recently or coming out soon?
So in about 5 months, I will have a novel coming out. It's a young adult horror novel called A Misfortune of Lake Monsters. And the premise is a high school senior's future is derailed when her family taps her to take over their generations-old legacy of secretly impersonating the town lake monster. But when she discovers a real monster with a taste for human flesh hunting in the lake, she must break the secret so she and her best friends can stop the slaughter. And that's out on July 2nd from Camcat Books.
Fantastic. David, anything out recently or besides this lovely short story that we had in Lightspeed or coming out soon?
Oh, thank you. I have things in the works and nothing I can announce yet.
Okay.
I do have a story forthcoming in Lightspeed, which seems to be the status quo for me. But I don't know when that will be published. So everything is forthcoming. Nothing. It's all a secret right now.
Secrets are good.
Yes.
Yeah, but secrets are frustrating because you can't announce yet. It's so annoying.
It is annoying. Hopefully soon, I can say.
Okay, good. Well, thank you both for having been here to speak with me this week. I've enjoyed our conversation. Next week on Shining Moon, we'll be taking another walk in the dark with our second episode on dark fantasy and horror. I'll be speaking with Linz McLeod, Susan Palumbo, Sam W. Pashota, Tara Campbell, and Kat Day on that topic. We'll have 5 authors and editors. It'll be a jam-packed episode, so be sure to tune in. Hit the like and subscribe buttons if you have those available to hit. And we are out. And